Across hundreds of coastal communities, everyday routines unfolded exactly as they had countless times before. Children studied peacefully as teachers continued afternoon lessons. In moments, their earthquake training would become critically important. Nearly 100 kilometers offshore, one of the largest ruptures ever recorded had just begun, far beneath the seabed.
The first tremors arrived subtly. Japan's advanced earthquake awareness and preparedness immediately prompted people to react.
Within seconds, one of the most powerful earthquakes in recorded history was unfolding. Every passing moment would reshape the lives of millions.
The earthquake continued to grow stronger. Japan's strict building codes helped many structures withstand the violent shaking, but everyone understood this was no ordinary seismic event. Across the region, businesses paused instantly. Training, preparation and calm decision-making became essential as the shaking intensified. Within moments, television stations across Japan interrupted regular programming to report an earthquake unlike anything the nation had experienced in generations.
Japan's advanced early warning systems automatically slowed transportation networks, reducing the risk of further tragedy as critical seconds passed.
For many communities, surviving the earthquake felt like the greatest challenge. Few yet realized that a far greater is. As seismic data streamed into monitoring centers, experts confirmed the unimaginable. A massive tsunami had been.
The warnings spread rapidly across northeastern Japan. Coastal residents were urged to evacuate immediately, even though the approaching tsunami remained invisible from shore.
Years of disaster preparedness shaped the response. Communities moved quickly, understanding that every minute could mean the difference between life and death.
Far offshore, the tsunami crossed the deep ocean almost unnoticed. Invisible to most observers, it carried unimaginable energy toward the coast.
Across the coastline, practiced evacuation procedures were put into action. Communities moved with urgency, trusting the warning systems that had been developed over decades. In countless neighborhoods, strangers became helpers. Every available hand was used to move the most vulnerable to safety.
Preparation and discipline allowed thousands to evacuate efficiently, but the available time was rapidly disappearing.
One of the earliest visible signs had appeared. The ocean itself was beginning to retreat, revealing the immense force gathering beyond the horizon.
For many witnesses, the rapidly retreating ocean confirmed the warnings. The tsunami was no longer a possibility, it was approaching.
From above, the approaching tsunami first appeared as a barely visible line. In reality, it carried extraordinary energy capable of reshaping entire communities.
Emergency teams watched carefully, understanding that the first wave would arrive within minutes.
The tsunami was now visible. What had traveled silently across the Pacific had become an unstoppable force moving directly toward the coast.
Within moments, the first surge entered the harbor. The sea was no longer behaving like ordinary waves. It had become a fast-moving wall of water.
Despite protective seawalls, the unprecedented height and force of the tsunami overwhelmed coastal defenses.
Within minutes, seawater transformed familiar streets into powerful channels. The speed of the flooding left almost.
Ports designed to withstand powerful storms faced a force unlike anything in modern memory. The sea carried vessels and debris far beyond the shoreline.
From higher ground, survivors witnessed entire neighborhoods disappear beneath rapidly advancing floodwaters.
The tsunami advanced several kilometers inland, overwhelming neighborhoods, roads, and critical infrastructure across northeastern Japan.
Search and rescue operations began almost immediately despite dangerous conditions. Every accessible street became a waterway. Air crews quickly became a lifeline, reaching areas that had become completely inaccessible by road.
Entire transportation networks were cut off within minutes, isolating communities across the disaster zone. Industrial districts suffered widespread flooding, creating enormous logistical challenges for emergency responders.
Even as the disaster continued unfolding, medical teams and volunteers immediately organized life-saving assistance for displaced residents.
As the first hour of the disaster unfolded, the full scale of the catastrophe was only beginning to emerge. With roads no longer accessible, rescue teams increasingly relied on helicopters to locate isolated survivors and coordinate emergency operations.
Every flooded neighborhood presented new challenges. Strong currents and hidden debris made each rescue operation slow and deliberate.
Rescue operations focused first on locations where groups of survivors had gathered above the rising floodwaters. Schools, community centers, and public buildings quickly became shelters, providing immediate safety for thousands forced to leave their homes.
Beyond the cities, the tsunami reached farmland and rural communities, affecting livelihoods across an enormous area.
Emergency responders faced multiple challenges simultaneously as flooding, structural damage, and isolated fires complicated rescue operations.
Accurate information became essential. Command centers worked continuously to prioritize rescue efforts across hundreds of affected communities.
Reinforcements arrived rapidly from across Japan as one of the largest emergency mobilizations in the nation's history gathered momentum. Tsunamis often arrive in multiple waves. Authorities continued urging everyone to remain on higher ground as dangerous currents persisted.
As the afternoon continued, thousands of emergency responders pressed forward with one shared purpose: to save as many lives as possible.
From above, the scale of the disaster became painfully clear. Entire neighborhoods had disappeared beneath the tsunami within only a matter of minutes. Highly trained rescue crews worked continuously from the air, reaching locations that had become completely isolated by the flooding.
Relief operations expanded rapidly as thousands of displaced residents arrived at emergency shelters throughout the region.
Healthcare workers continued treating injuries, while preparing for the growing number of people arriving from flooded communities.
Transportation networks suffered extensive damage, making access to many communities extremely difficult during the critical first hours.
The tremendous force of the tsunami carried heavy fishing vessels far beyond the shoreline, demonstrating the extraordinary energy released by the ocean.
Additional rescue forces arrived throughout the afternoon, bringing specialized equipment and personnel from every available region of Japan.
Technology played a vital role, allowing emergency coordinators to direct life-saving resources where they were needed most.
As the waters shifted, enormous fields of debris created new hazards for both rescue teams and affected communities.
Although the disaster was still unfolding, thousands of responders had already begun one of the largest humanitarian rescue operations in Japan's modern history.
As the first surge began to recede in some areas, it revealed an entirely transformed landscape.
Every street presented new challenges. Rescue crews advanced carefully, balancing urgency with the need to operate safely in unstable conditions.
Even after the initial impact, dangerous currents remained throughout the harbor. Authorities restricted access while structural inspections began. Emergency coordination depended upon constant communication. Every update helped direct life-saving resources toward the communities facing the greatest need.
The disaster extended far beyond the coastline. Rural communities and agricultural regions also faced widespread flooding and disruption. Shelters quickly became centers of safety, relief, and information for thousands displaced by the disaster.
Communities came together immediately, transforming public buildings into organized spaces where people could receive shelter, medical care, and essential support.
Recovery planning began almost immediately, even as rescue efforts remained the highest priority. Critical transportation systems would require careful inspection before service could safely resume across the affected region. As daylight slowly faded, the rescue effort continued relentlessly. Responders remained.
As the water began its return to the sea, it left behind a landscape forever changed. Every river and canal.
Industrial areas required careful assessment before responders could safely enter, ensuring that additional hazards were identified and controlled.
Reliable communication became one of the most valuable resources during the response, allowing rescue teams to coordinate across an enormous disaster area.
Search operations expanded street by street, with every accessible route carefully examined by highly trained rescue personnel.
Air rescue operations provided critical access to locations that remained unreachable by road or boat.
Medical teams worked continuously to ensure that every rescued survivor received timely care, despite the overwhelming demands placed on healthcare services.
As more responders arrived, the emergency operation evolved into a coordinated national effort, involving thousands of personnel.
Humanitarian assistance began arriving almost immediately, ensuring that shelters received the essential resources needed to support thousands of displaced residents. Detailed aerial surveys would become invaluable in understanding the full extent of the disaster and planning the enormous reconstruction effort that lay ahead.
The first hours after the tsunami demonstrated extraordinary resilience and coordination. By
late afternoon, rescue operations stretched across hundreds of kilometers of coastline. Every available resource was being directed toward protecting lives.
Large emergency coordination centers became the backbone of the response, allowing thousands of personnel to work together efficiently across the disaster zone.
Shelters provided more than safety. They became places where communities could receive food, medical care, reliable information and reassurance. Every flight required careful planning. Air crews constantly adjusted their missions as new information arrived from emergency command centers.
The fishing industry, central to many coastal communities, had suffered enormous losses that would take years to rebuild.
Before transportation could be restored, every bridge, roadway and utility corridor required careful inspection to ensure public safety.
Utility crews prepared to restore essential services as soon as emergency conditions allowed, knowing electricity and communications would be vital for recovery.
An enormous humanitarian supply network rapidly formed, ensuring that emergency shelters received the resources needed to support thousands of displaced residents. As daylight continued, the immense scale of both the disaster and the response became increasingly visible from the air. Although the devastation was immense, the response had already begun to reveal another story, one of courage.
As the first response expanded, every available agency worked together with remarkable coordination. Resources continued arriving from across the country.
From above, the response revealed extraordinary organization as thousands of personnel worked together across an immense disaster zone.
Every landing marked another successful rescue mission, but countless more communities still required assistance before nightfall.
Planning extended far beyond the present moment. Emergency managers were already preparing for the challenges that darkness would soon bring.
Some isolated communities could only be reached by air, making helicopters an essential lifeline during the first critical hours.
Detailed engineering assessments would help guide the rebuilding of stronger coastal defenses in the years ahead. As evening approached, shelters prepared to care for thousands of people who would spend the night away from their homes.
Heavy engineering resources were positioned throughout the region, ready to begin clearing debris and restoring access as conditions became safe.
Behind every rescue mission stood an enormous logistical effort, ensuring that essential supplies reached the people who needed them most.
Hour by hour, the disaster response grew stronger. Amid extraordinary challenges, the dedication of responder and volunteers became. Although several hours had passed since the earthquake, the emergency response continued expanding as rescue teams worked tirelessly.
Regional airports became critical lifelines, allowing emergency supplies and specialized rescue personnel to reach northeastern Japan as quickly as possible.
Every shipment represented vital support for communities facing one of the most difficult days in their history. Monitoring continued long after the first waves arrived, ensuring authorities remained informed about changing coastal conditions and potential additional hazards.
Temporary command bases allowed thousands of responders from different organizations to operate together efficiently under a unified emergency response.
Careful documentation during the first day would later help guide one of the largest reconstruction projects in Japan's modern history.
As daylight slowly faded, emergency shelters prepared to support thousands of residents through the coming night.
Restoring electricity and communications would become essential for both emergency response and the long recovery that lay ahead.
Across Japan, humanitarian organizations mobilized rapidly, demonstrating the strength of coordinated community support during a national emergency. As the first afternoon drew toward evening, the rescue effort showed no sign of slowing. Across the affected region, as daylight gradually faded, emergency operations continued without pause. Every remaining hour of sunlight was used to reach isolated communities.
Schools and public facilities across northeastern Japan became safe havens, providing shelter, medical care, and vital information to thousands of displaced residents.
Community volunteers worked alongside emergency personnel, ensuring that those arriving at shelters received immediate care, food, warmth, and reassurance.
As evening approached, emergency managers shifted their focus towards sustaining rescue efforts throughout the night under increasingly challenging conditions.
Portable infrastructure allowed emergency crews to continue operating safely after sunset, extending life-saving missions well into the night.
Logistics teams worked continuously to ensure that every shelter received the essential supplies needed for the first night after the disaster. Transportation specialists began documenting damage immediately, laying the groundwork for restoring critical connections across the region.
Heavy equipment was strategically positioned throughout the region, ready to begin debris removal and infrastructure recovery once rescue operations allowed.
The response continued to grow stronger with each passing hour, demonstrating extraordinary cooperation between emergency services. The first hours after the tsunami would be remembered not only for the immense destruction, but also for the remarkable courage.
Even as the immediate danger began to ease in some locations, the emergency response entered a new phase focused on sustained rescue, relief, and coordination.
Behind every rescue mission stood hundreds of specialists managing information, communications, logistics, and planning around the clock. Every helicopter returning from a mission was rapidly prepared for another flight, maximizing the remaining daylight available for rescue operations. Across Japan, relief organizations worked tirelessly to ensure that emergency shelters remained supplied throughout the unfolding crisis. Detailed aerial mapping would provide engineers with essential information needed to safely rebuild transportation networks and coastal infrastructure. Shelters became a place of safety, compassion, and community, offering practical assistance while helping people remain connected with loved ones. Recovery preparations advanced alongside rescue efforts, recognizing that rebuilding would require enormous engineering resources and careful planning.
Even after the initial waves had passed, careful monitoring remained essential as authorities assessed ongoing coastal conditions.
By the end of the first afternoon, thousands of responders, volunteers, healthcare workers, engineers, and the events of March 11, 2011 would forever shape Japan's history, yet alongside profound loss emerged enduring examples of courage, preparedness.
As rescue efforts continued, the scale of coordination across northeastern Japan became increasingly evident.
National coordination ensured that personnel, equipment, medical resources, and humanitarian assistance reached the affected region as efficiently as possible. A continuous supply chain quickly formed, ensuring emergency shelters and rescue teams received the essential resources needed for sustained operations.
Continuous maintenance and rapid turnaround allowed rescue aircraft to remain operational throughout the critical first day.
Scientific assessments began immediately, providing valuable information for both emergency operations and future recovery planning. Healthcare professionals addressed immediate medical needs, while also supporting the physical and emotional well-being of displaced families.
Restoring critical infrastructure would become one of the most important steps in helping affected communities begin their recovery.
Transportation specialists carefully evaluated every section of the railway network before planning safe restoration of passenger and freight services.
The response had grown into a nationwide effort, marked by extraordinary dedication, careful planning, and cooperation among.
Though the first day was far from over, the determination of responders and communities across Japan had already become a powerful testament to resilience.
As daylight slowly faded, rescue operations remained fully active. Every remaining hour of visibility was used to reach temporary operational bases became the center of an extraordinary nationwide response, bringing together specialists from every field of emergency management.
Behind every convoy stood thousands of volunteers working tirelessly to ensure essential supplies reached shelters throughout the affected region.
As evening approached, shelters transformed into temporary communities where safety, compassion, and essential care remained the highest priorities.
Detailed inspections were essential before transportation networks could safely reopen and support the long recovery ahead.
Keeping emergency vehicles supplied with fuel became a critical logistical priority as rescue operations expanded across the disaster zone.
Hospitals throughout Japan coordinated closely to ensure patients could receive timely medical care despite the extraordinary demands placed upon the healthcare system.
Every inspection carried an important purpose, ensuring that rebuilding efforts would begin with accurate information and careful planning.
As evening drew nearer, the first day of response continued with unwavering determination.
Although many hours had passed since the earthquake struck, rescue operations remained at full intensity as responders worked against the approaching sunset. Every flight demanded careful coordination, precision, and constant communication as crews searched for remaining isolated survivors. The logistics effort continued expanding, ensuring rescue teams and evacuation shelters would remain supplied long after daylight disappeared. Inside every shelter, compassion and cooperation became just as important as food, medicine, and emergency supplies. Detailed assessments of ports and harbors would be essential for restoring transportation, fishing, and commercial activity throughout the affected region.
Recovery planning advanced alongside rescue operations, ensuring that every available hour was used effectively.
Infrastructure specialists prepared for the enormous task of restoring essential services once emergency conditions allowed safe access.
The coordinated response now extended across an entire region, reflecting extraordinary dedication from emergency responders, volunteers.
As the sun moved lower over the Pacific, the determination of those responding never wavered.
With sunset approaching, emergency responders intensified their efforts, determined to use every remaining minute of daylight to locate and assist survivors.
Preparation for night operations had already begun, ensuring rescue missions could continue safely after darkness fell.
Across the region, shelters prepared for the first night by ensuring that every arriving family had access to food, warmth, medical. Extraordinary humanitarian supply network continued operating without interruption, providing essential support for both responders and displaced communities.
Detailed engineering surveys provided the information needed to safely begin rebuilding critical infrastructure in the days and weeks ahead. The scale of cooperation visible from the air reflected one of the largest coordinated emergency responses ever undertaken in Japan. Restoring electricity, communications, and transportation would become the next essential step in supporting communities during the long recovery process.
As the first evening approached, hope endured through the unwavering dedication of thousands of responders and volunteers who continued